You are going to hear the story of one of the craziest geniuses, Isaac Newton, one of the brightest minds of all time. The life of this tormented thinker, the Pope of modern science, is as brilliant as it is unsettling. For nearly 2 centuries, his dark sides have been hidden from the world. And you will see that behind the myth of a prolific pure spirit of staggering power hides an atypical being, capable of the most perfect oddities. And who, for decades, in secret, filled manuscripts with texts discussing the date of the apocalypse, dealing with alchemy, or the quest for the philosopher's stone, while concocting in his laboratories recipes that would make witches' mixtures look like insipid broths. Isaac Newton was born prematurely in a farming family during the winter of 1643 in a small village in Lincolnshire, England. In this very house, which still stands today, surprisingly, it is said that he was so small that he could have been slipped into a shoebox. And yet he survived. A solitary and introverted child, his school reports describe him as passive and inattentive. But the young Newton already has a sharp and keen mind. At 12, he already demonstrates an insatiable curiosity about the world and a passion for mechanisms. He tinkers with water clocks, makes sundials, and invents a mini windmill that grinds wheat thanks to the work provided by a mouse he calls My Miller. And to light his way to school in the early morning, he even makes himself a lantern out of thin paper. Marbles was clearly not his forte. Due to his birth condition, Newton is predestined to end up working the earth. But several people around him foresee the genius that infuses in him and insist to his mother that he continues his studies. At 18, he joins the famous Trinity College at the University of Cambridge, where he is confronted with the works of the greatest thinkers of his time. And as an autodidact, devours everything that comes his way. In 1664 then, at age 21, Newton discovers a passion for mathematics, opening up new, unsuspected horizons. In just over a year, he practically assimilates all the foundations of the discipline. He writes, "Plato is my friend, Aristotle is my friend, but my best friend is the truth." 2 years later, frustrated by the limitations of the mathematics of his time, he invents infinitesimal calculus, an entirely new way of proceeding that allows for describing continuous changes, and will later become essential to all areas of physical sciences and engineering, while giving birth to a whole separate branch of mathematics. He's only 23 and still a student. During the summer of 1665, the bubonic plague hits England, causing 75,000 deaths in the city of London alone. The University of Cambridge closes, forcing Newton to withdraw to the countryside. He will spend 18 isolated months there, 18 months away from the world, during which he tackles virtually all the major fields of his time on his own. Isolated in his room, at times engulfed in complete darkness, he conducts experiments in mechanics, physics, and develops his theories on the properties of light and colors, and blackens hundreds of blank pages with comments and formulas, philosophical reflections, or physical demonstrations about its mysteries or nature. During this period, often alone, withdrawn into himself, with only the company of his sharp mind, which gives him no respite. Newton is a workaholic. His thirst for overflowing knowledge nourishes him to the point where he forgets himself, no longer knowing what day it is, if he has already eaten. In his writings, he confesses that he can sit for hours on the edge of his bed, paralyzed by the sudden influx of tumultuous reflections. His grandmother worries that he never goes out to get some air, except only at night, to scrutinize the moon for hours with a prototype telescope of his own making until he falls from fatigue. If there's one thing you can't reproach Newton for, it's not putting his heart into his experiments. To try to understand how the eye perceives light, and to test one of his theories on color perception. He even goes as far as to stick a leather sewing needle under his eyeball, then describes in great detail the visions of colored circles this causes. Miraculously, he suffered no after effects from having thus poked his eye. Around the same time, Newton decides to stare at the sun as long as he can bear it in order to study the effects this has on his vision. Spoiler alert, this is a very bad idea. And he nearly goes blind and has to spend 3 days in a dark room before his eyes recover. That's quite the guy. Back in Cambridge, and now a professor, Newton gives lectures that are often deserted by students who find him quite boring, which doesn't seem to bother him much more than anything else. And when no one shows up, he simply goes back to work in his laboratory, fiddling with his prisms and lenses. Newton is definitely a unique character, endowed with a tormented personality, brilliant beyond all measure, stubborn and solitary. His relationships with others are often tense and problematic. Newton is seen by his colleagues as distant and haughty, and often appears gloomy, sometimes extremely irritable and suspicious to the point of paranoia. This perhaps explains why he is known to have no lasting friendships, and his love life was the definition of non-existence. Certainly indifferent to the pleasures of the flesh, he probably remained single all his life. In any case, he is known to have had no affairs, just some intense letter correspondences with a Swiss mathematician. In 1661, after thousands of hours spent studying the refraction and dispersion of light, Newton invented a reflecting telescope with a concave mirror devoid of chromatic aberrations, which far surpassed anything known at the time. In 1672, at 29, he joined the Royal Society, disclosing some of his revolutionary research. By proving that white light can be decomposed and is actually made up of a spectrum of several colors. A rainbow waiting to reveal itself, which can then in turn be recombined to once again give birth to white light. 12 years later, in 1684, the astronomer Edmund Halley, the discoverer of the famous comet that would later take his name, sought Newton's help to try to solve a puzzle that was bothering many scientists at that time. Namely, why do planets follow elliptical trajectories on their orbit? Isaac essentially responds to him that it's obvious to him. He has proven it through calculation. The reason Halley is astonished, he asks him to see his results, and Newton is unable to find his writings again. I don't know if you realize, but that's the equivalent of a yes. Well, I found a cure that can overcome the plague, but I don't really remember where I put the paper. Newton agrees to redo the calculations, and, faced with the numerous questions, covers this new research field. He immerses himself for 2 years in intense reflections to finally come back with a pure masterpiece. The Principia Mathematica, or mathematical principles of natural physics, which are a kind of final boss of physics, the equivalent of a drop the mic to the universe already. At the heart of the Principia are the 3 laws of motion, which lay all the foundations of classical mechanics. With the first, which shows that an object remains stationary or in motion until an external force acts on it. The second, which tells us that a force is always equal to mass multiplied by acceleration. Lastly, the third law states that for every action, there is an equal reaction in the same direction but opposite sense. By stating these 3 laws, Newton instantly becomes the father of modern mechanics and lays the foundations of dynamics. But the Principia goes beyond explaining falling apples. It's a bombshell, in the sense that in a few hundred pages it explains how objects move and interact on Earth, but also absolutely everywhere in the universe. Because the theory of universal attraction that Newton develops there dissects the force of gravity at the origin of the movement of all objects, whether these are paving stones, asteroids, or planets. In the Principia, for the first time, a human mind has produced a reflection so penetrating and unexpected that it allows to explain and link every movement in the universe. With these laws of universal attraction, Newton practically killed the game, because he broke the shackles by thinking beyond the theories of his time. Without making the distinction, like many at that time, between a sublunary world and a supralunary world, he treats the universe as a single whole, where a law reigns to govern them all. He is the first to show that every object in the universe exerts an attraction on all the others. The gravitational force binding 2 objects is related to the product of their masses, and inversely proportional to the square of the distance that separates them. Although the publication of the 3 works making up the Principia had the effect of a bomb whose blast soon spread throughout Europe, ideas. The Principia remain, according to some, among the most inaccessible books ever written. It must be said that Newton seems to have taken a perverse pleasure in intentionally making most of his texts difficult to access, which are filled with austere equations. And this in order not to be bothered to use his words by mediocre mathematicians. But for those who manage to follow his rigorous, logical, sober and clinical approach and decipher his calculations, the Principia are a beacon, a compass, especially since the style of the work lays the foundation for the modern scientific method. Once again, it must be understood that the Principia do not propose simple improvements to theory, but rather to overthrow an entire part of our worldview by proposing an absolutely new understanding of nature and the laws that govern the universe. In one fell swoop, Newton allows us to explain things as varied as the movement of tides, the trajectory of planets and cannonballs, while accounting for the difficulty of moving an elephant, or the reasons that prevent us from being ejected into space while the Earth spins under our feet at hundreds of kilometers per hour. In fact, the Principia is filled with so many groundbreaking discoveries that one doesn't know whether to be amazed by the discoveries themselves or by the fact that someone could have thought of them. After their publication, Newton is at the height of his fame. The famous German mathematician Leibniz, with whom he had long and bitter disputes over the paternity of infinitesimal calculus, would later estimate that no human being can come closer to the gods. And the craziest thing about all this is that Newton didn't really try to make all his discoveries known and shared. He often recoils at the idea of communicating his ideas, and when he does publish them, it's usually years after completing his research. For example, Isaac kept some of his work in optics to himself, and without apparent reason, for over 20 years. While these later contributed to revolutionizing our understanding of light. After inventing the famous infinitesimal calculus, which would have simplified the lives of many mathematicians if they had known about it, he preferred to keep quiet about the discovery, which he kept to himself for 27 years. As for Volume 3 of the Principia, the one that holds and illuminates the whole, it almost never saw the light of day. For just as the work was almost finished, Newton, vexed and tired by an endless dispute over the paternity of the inverse square law, with a certain Robert Hooke, refused to deliver the final manuscripts. And it was only after numerous diplomatic circumventions and a shower of insistent flatteries that Halley managed to obtain the precious writings of the final volume. Except that the Royal Society, which had promised to finance the publication of the Principia, withdrew from the project, because its entire budget was depleted. In the appearance of the very expensive work, The History of Fish, which turned out to be a fiasco, Newton refused to contribute to the financing of the publication of his own theories. It was still Halley who saved the project by paying for the printing out of his own pocket. The height of irony. Halley had just accepted a position as a clerk at the Royal Society, which, not having the means to pay him a salary, paid him for nearly a year in unsold copies of The History of Fish. All this, put end to end, is already starting to make a good story in itself. But Newton doesn't stop there. Having become rich, famous and powerful, and soon knighted by the Queen, the one who has become Sir Isaac Newton is now involved in politics. He thus makes a few short appearances as a deputy in the English Parliament, even though he rarely participates in the debate. And above all, he will hold the position of President of the Royal Society and Director of the Mint for nearly 25 years. When in 1700, Newton is appointed to the head of the British institution that mints the sterling pound. It is estimated that nearly 20% of the coins then in circulation are counterfeit. As rigorous as he is incorruptible, he will fight counterfeiting there for nearly 20 years with absolutely relentless determination. Hunting down counterfeiters with sometimes frightening zeal, going so far as to tail suspects himself and disguise himself to eavesdrop on conversations in disreputable pubs. Under his orders, hundreds of counterfeiters are imprisoned and dozens of others are sentenced to death by hanging. In parallel, at the head of the Royal Society, the most prestigious of all the scientific institutions in the country and surely the world. At that time, Newton also instills, to a lesser extent, a semblance of terror. It must be said that being the president requires tact and social intelligence, two qualities that Isaac seems to be absolutely devoid of. He will even exceptionally take advantage of the power his position gives him to denigrate or minimize the contribution of some of his colleagues with whom he may have had vigorous altercations in the past. Through the intermediary, one remains a gentleman. Thus, the portrait of Robert Hooke, with whom Newton had deep disagreements, strangely disappeared from the institution's funds shortly after he took over. So much so that no one knows today what Hooke looked like, even though he was one of the greatest scientists of his time. A scientist had the misfortune of crossing paths with a sensitive giant. When Newton died in 1727, at the age of 84, England buried him as a superstar, as a hero. Sumptuous funerals are organised, and his coffin, after being displayed in Westminster Abbey, is buried in the nave alongside the king's. For more than 2 centuries, books are written about his life, his theories, monuments erected or imagined in his honour. And a number of artists seek to represent his genius, such as the painter William Blake, who depicts Newton naked, drawing some geometric shapes as if touched by divine grace. And no one suspects that on the other side of Newton's light, a huge part of shadow has remained hidden. Because behind the myth of a pure rational mind, another aspect of Newton's life slumbers. In 1936, nearly 200 years after the death of the great scientist, the American economist John Keynes, the one who invented Keynesianism, acquires at auction a trunk that belonged to Isaac himself and contains countless manuscripts and documents not published during his lifetime. Delving into this kind of treasure chest is a bit like accessing Newton's diary, because in thousands of personal notes, he puts in writing the ideas he preferred to keep to himself, and which have been kept secret for over 2 centuries by his heirs. These ideas are not scientific. On these manuscripts are inscribed the quests of a mind as obsessed with his research in mathematics, celestial mechanics or optics as he was with alchemy or theology. And here is revealed a man who spent a large part of his life trying to decipher alleged secret codes hidden in biblical narratives. A man who, in his clandestine laboratory, is trying to make the elixir of youth, like developing the philosopher's stone to transmute metals into gold. The images you see scrolling on the screen are photos of some of these manuscripts that have been digitized by the Newton Project. In one instance, Newton teaches himself Hebrew in his relentless pursuit of truth, in order to be able to decipher the original texts, in which he spends countless hours studying the plans of King Solomon's lost temple, convinced that it is hidden there. Mathematical clues that allow the calculation of the date of Christ's second coming to earth, or even that of the end of the world. Newton incorrectly estimated that the Messiah would return in 1948. To my knowledge, no one showed up. Let's hope he was also wrong in his treatise on the apocalypse, as his predictions lead him to place the end of times in 2060. In another treatise, this time of an alchemical nature, Isaac writes a completely crazy essay titled Praxis, in which one can read: Articus. He teaches us that his dissolved fire gives birth to stones and allows them to multiply 4 times each, but no more. You can amalgamate the stone with the mercury of 3 eagles or more and thus multiply it infinitely. Later notes discuss preparing philosophical mercury through fermentation and mediation involving doves and Diana. Then Newton invites us to mix lead with citric acid before letting it all simmer for 10 days in the moonlight. In the 1970s, to have some indirect evidence of the reality of these experiences in alchemy, we analysed with modern methods the composition of a lock of hair that belonged to the late Isaac. And it was found to contain concentrations of mercury nearly 40 times higher than those found in an average human being. Now, mercury is an element that, at that time, was of interest mainly to hatters, thermometer manufacturers, and alchemists, for whom it is a key element. Some biographers of Newton even hypothesized that the intense period of nervous depression he went through in 1693, and which led to a bout of madness accompanied by hallucinations, before plunging him for several months into a state of silent prostration and paranoia, originates from a gradual and fortunately temporary poisoning by lead or mercury, the toxic fumes of which then filled his alchemist's workshop. Unless these crises were triggered by the abrupt end of his correspondence with a Swiss astronomer, Nicolas Facio de Duillier, who may have been his only true friend. We will most certainly never know, But one thing is certain for Newton: the study of alchemy, as well as religious texts, is not a small anecdotal activity practiced in his spare time. Considering the enormous amount of documents that have come down to us, it is estimated that he devoted nearly half of his life to them. And that's without counting that a large part of his writings on alchemy were presumably lost in a fire in his laboratory. That his dog supposedly caused by knocking over a candle. So much so that the true extent of his work in these areas may have been even greater. If the existence of all these texts and surprising research was kept quiet by Newton during his lifetime, and then kept secret for so long by his heirs, it's because their content would have greatly displeased the Church and, more generally, the established order. Because if Newton tries to discover and decode hidden messages in the chronology of biblical prophecies, it's because he thinks that the divine word has been corrupted by the translation of men and the Church. Add to this the fact that Isaac is a discreet follower of the heretical Arian sect, whose fundamental principle was the rejection of the Holy Trinity. And that we find in his hidden writings passages full of ego trips, where he confesses to considering himself one of those chosen by God to convey the truth. On how prophetic texts should be understood, it is clear why it was preferable for him that the orthodox heretic hunters of his time knew nothing about his practices. Newton was even a member of the Rosicrucians, some of whose followers were convinced they would one day be able to speak with angels by becoming invisible. In his writings, he admits to not believing in these absurdities and only associates with this group for convenience, as it includes powerful and influential individuals. His alchemy research would also have been poorly received. These practices were forbidden in the 18th century, partly because the English crown feared a devaluation of gold if the philosopher's stone were to be discovered, and partly because alchemy was then mostly practiced by charlatans and other impostors, ill-intentioned dream sellers. In short, the opening of this trunk, like the publication of the Principia by the way, had the effect of a bomb, a blast. To understand why a mind of Newton's caliber discreetly assembled one of the largest libraries of alchemy and occult sciences of his time, these researchers must be placed in the context of an era where the boundary between chemistry and alchemy is porous. In essence, is it about trying to uncover the secrets of the invisible forces that move the planets and prevent the moon from falling to Earth? Exploring nature's mysteries, light, and attempting to transmute metals and create magical elixirs. Isn't it a little bit the same thing? In fact, one might even wonder if this passion of Newton's for esotericism hasn't been there from the start. In one of Newton's surviving childhood notebooks, the young Newton gives us the recipe for a potion of his own creation, supposed to be an effective remedy for wounds. Mix a little mint, a little wormwood, 300,000 centipedes previously decapitated, crush everything in a mortar and dilute in 20 litres of beer. Then let it ferment before taking 2 to 3 times a day. At age 12, he began boarding with his uncle, an apothecary. Isaac is already evolving amidst vials of all kinds and works in which science and magic mix. In one of his bedside books, when he was a child, there is a chapter dealing with the study of the nature of language, followed closely by another, debating the different ways to master perpetual motion, before enumerating all the ways to uproot an oak tree with a hair. Another text later attempts to prove that the moon is uninhabited. Another that it is possible to calculate the size of hell. I love it, it's better. Picsou magazine explains why one of the greatest geniuses in human history dedicated his entire life to his work, like oscillating between the rational and the irrational. For Newton, these are just two aspects of the same coin made of a single metal, responding to a single logic. The quest to learn how to decipher the codes used by God, whether these were hidden in alleged sacred texts or in the arrangement of the gears of celestial mechanics. Newton is an ambiguous figure, either the first thinker of the Age of Reason or the last of the magicians. I'll let you choose which side you prefer to see the coin fall. Despite his repeated sleepless nights spent observing the stars, despite his hundreds of skipped meals, his thousands of hours spent breathing toxic fumes, Newton passed away at the venerable age of 84, refusing, on his deathbed, to receive the last rites. Until the end, free thinker, free believer. Against the current, the English poet Alexander Pope proposed to inscribe on his marble mausoleum. The laws of nature were hidden in the night. Then God said, "Let Newton be," and all became light. But the proposal was rejected. Instead, this epitaph was engraved. Here lies Isaac Newton, knight, who with a force of mind almost divine and mathematical principles peculiar to himself, has explored the course and figures of the planets, the paths of comets, the tides of the sea, the dissimilarities in the rays of light. Mortal, congratulate yourself that such a great man has lived for the honor of the human race. But perhaps the one who speaks of it best is still him. In a manuscript now kept at the University of Cambridge, arrived at the twilight of his life, Newton wrote, "I do not know what I may have seemed to the world. To me, I have been merely a child playing on the shore, happy to find from time to time a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than the others, while the great ocean of truth lay before me, still unexplored." If he had found the elixir of eternal life and he was still alive today, Newton would undoubtedly have been delighted to learn that there are telescopes several tens of meters in diameter that still operate using some of his discoveries. That these abundant ideas have helped make it possible to land on the moon and explore the solar system further than he could have imagined. And that we have even discovered that there is a natural phenomenon, radioactivity, which transforms some elements into others. Perhaps they would have even more appreciated the fact that, as powerful as these laws of universal gravitation are, they have proven incapable of describing the conditions, reigning in extremely powerful gravitational fields, or when objects reach speeds close to that of light. And that, more than 2 centuries after the publication of these Principia in 1915, a young German physicist of 36 years, a certain Einstein, came in turn to burst the previous framework, dynamited the old world views. And tell me what you think of this story mode in the comments. I'm interested.